In the spring of 1943, in a small town in occupied Poland, Nazi soldiers arrived at a local brewery with orders to conduct a surprise inspection. They marched through the production floor, their boots echoing against the concrete, their eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, every possible hiding place. What they didn't know was that just meters above their heads, inside a massive empty beer fermentation tank, a family of 5 sat in complete darkness, holding their breath, their hearts pounding so loudly they feared the soldiers below could hear them. The tank's iron walls were thick enough to muffle sound, but not thick enough to stop the terror. One cough, one cry from the youngest child, one shift of weight that caused the metal to creak, and they would all be discovered. And the woman who had put them there, the brewery owner herself, stood calmly below, answering the soldiers' questions with a smile, knowing that if they decided to climb the ladder and open that tank, she would be executed on the spot alongside the family she was hiding. This is the story they never taught you in history class. This is the story of how an ordinary businesswoman became one of the most ingenious rescuers of World War II, using the one place the Nazis would never think to look, inside the very product they loved to drink. But to understand how this impossible act of courage happened, you need to understand the world she lived in, a world where one wrong move meant death, where trust was a luxury no one could afford, and where the smell of hops and barley became the scent of salvation for those marked for extermination. By the end of this video, you'll discover not just how she pulled off this unbelievable feat, but why her name has been almost completely erased from history, and why the family she saved stayed silent about their rescuer for over 30 years after the war ended. The town of Tarnów, Poland, in early 1942, was a place frozen in fear. The Nazi occupation had transformed what was once a thriving market town into a ghetto, a holding pen for over 15,000 Jewish families waiting for deportation to the death camps. The streets that once filled with merchants selling produce and craftsmen displaying their wares were now patrolled by SS officers and their collaborators, men who had the power to decide who lived and who died with nothing more than a pointed finger. In the center of this suffocating nightmare sat the Brewery, a 3-story building of red brick and copper pipes that had been producing beer for over 60 years. The brewery had survived 2 world wars, economic collapse, and multiple regime changes, but nothing in its history prepared it for what it was about to become, a sanctuary hidden in plain sight. The brewery was owned by Maria Górska, a 41-year-old widow who had inherited the business from her husband after he died of pneumonia in 1939, just months before the German invasion. Maria was not a revolutionary. She was not a member of any underground resistance network. She had no military training, no weapons, no connections to partisan groups in the forests. What she had was something far more dangerous: a conscience that refused to stay quiet, and a brewery that operated under special German protection because it supplied beer to Wehrmacht officers stationed in the region. This dual reality, being both essential to the Nazi war machine and morally opposed to everything it represented, created a space of possibility that Maria would exploit in ways no one could have predicted. The Jewish family she would eventually hide, the Leibowicz family, had once been her neighbors. Samuel Leibowicz had been a tailor who made suits for Maria's late husband. His wife, Rachel, had taught piano to children in the town, including Maria's own daughter before she moved to Krakow. Their 3 children, ranging from age 6 to 14, had played in the same streets where Maria herself had grown up. They were not strangers to her. They were people whose laughter she had heard, whose troubles she had known, whose humanity was undeniable. When the ghetto was established in March of 1942, Maria watched as the Leibowicz family was forced from their home with only what they could carry. She watched as the Nazis painted a yellow star on their door. She watched as the neighborhood she had known her entire life was torn apart, family by family, cart by cart, scream by scream. For months, Maria did nothing. Not because she didn't care, but because she didn't know what to do. The penalty for hiding Jews was immediate execution, not just for the rescuer, but often for their entire family. The Nazis had made examples of those who tried to help, hanging their bodies in town squares as warnings to others who might feel a dangerous surge of compassion. But in January of 1943, everything changed. Maria received word through a former employee that the Leibowicz family had managed to escape a deportation roundup and were hiding in a collapsing basement on the edge of the ghetto, starving, freezing, and with nowhere else to go. The message was simple. They had 3 days before the next sweep, and after that they would be found and killed. Maria stood in her brewery that night, surrounded by the smell of fermenting grain and the hum of machinery, and she looked up at the massive empty tanks on the second floor, tanks large enough to hold thousands of liters of beer, tanks with hatches that locked from the outside, tanks that no one ever inspected once they were sealed. And she made a decision that would either save 5 lives or end 6. The plan Maria devised was insane by any reasonable measure, but in a world where sanity had already been murdered, insanity became the only logical response. She would smuggle the Leibowicz family into the brewery under cover of darkness, guide them up to the second floor where the fermentation tanks stood like iron giants, and seal them inside tank number 7, a vessel that had been emptied for cleaning 2 weeks prior and was scheduled to remain unused for at least another month. The tank was roughly 4 meters tall and 3 meters in diameter, with a small circular hatch at the top accessible only by ladder. Inside it was pitch black, damp, and reeked of stale beer and yeast residue, but it was also soundproof, temperature-controlled by the ambient cold of the brewery, and most importantly, it was a place the Nazis would never think to search because it served their own desires. German officers loved their beer, and the Brewery brewery was protected specifically because it kept them supplied. The cruelest irony of Maria's plan was that the very system designed to keep the occupation comfortable would become the shield that protected its victims. The extraction happened on a moonless night in late January of 1943. Maria sent her most trusted employee, an older man named Piotr, who had worked at the brewery since before the war, to the edge of the ghetto with a delivery cart typically used for transporting grain sacks. Hidden beneath actual sacks of barley, the 5 members of the Leibowicz family lay motionless, barely breathing, as Piotr navigated the back streets toward the brewery. Every checkpoint was a potential death sentence. Every Nazi patrol was a roll of the dice, but Piotr had been making deliveries to the brewery for 20 years, and the soldiers who saw him that night saw exactly what they expected to see. An old man doing his job, too tired and too unimportant to bother questioning. When the cart finally rolled into the brewery's loading dock, Maria was waiting. She locked the doors behind them, checked every window, and then with her own hands helped the family climb out from under the barley. They were skeletal, their clothes hanging off their bodies like rags on scarecrows. The children's eyes were too large for their faces, hollowed out by hunger and fear. Rachel Leibowicz could barely stand. Samuel tried to speak, to thank Maria, but she stopped him with a raised hand. There was no time for gratitude. There was only time for survival. Maria led them through the brewery in silence, past the copper boiling kettles, past the wooden barrels stacked to the ceiling, past the offices where Nazi inspectors had sat just days before, approving production quotas. She brought them to the base of tank number 7 and pointed upward. The ladder was narrow and slick with condensation. The youngest child, a 6-year-old girl named Esther, was too weak to climb on her own, so Samuel tied her to his back with a strip of fabric torn from his coat and carried her up, rung by rung, into the darkness above. One by one, the family disappeared into the tank. Maria had prepared the interior as best she could with blankets, a bucket for waste, containers of water, and bread wrapped in cloth to keep it from molding. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough, but it was everything she could risk. Once they were all inside, Maria climbed the ladder herself and spoke to them through the open hatch, explaining the rules that would keep them alive. No noise during the day, no movement when inspections happened, no light ever. She would come every night after the brewery closed to bring food and water and to empty the waste bucket. If she didn't come, it meant the Nazis were still in the building, and they had to wait in silence no matter how hungry or desperate they became. Then Maria did the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. She closed the hatch. She locked it from the outside. She climbed down the ladder and walked away, leaving 5 human beings sealed inside a metal tomb, trusting that she would return, trusting that she wouldn't be caught, trusting that the air inside would be enough to keep them breathing until nightfall. The sound of that hatch closing, the metallic clang of the locking mechanism sliding into place, would haunt Maria for the rest of her life. It was the sound of imprisonment and salvation happening at the same exact moment. Inside the tank, the Leibowicz family sat in total darkness, listening to Maria's footsteps fade away, and they understood with brutal clarity that their survival now depended entirely on the courage of one woman who had already risked everything just to give them this chance. The next morning, the brewery opened as usual. Workers arrived, machines hummed to life, and beer production continued without interruption. Nazi officers stopped by to check on their orders, joking with Maria about the quality of the latest batch, complimenting her on keeping the business running smoothly despite the war. And 20 feet above their heads, inside tank number 7, 5 people sat frozen in absolute silence, listening to the voices of the men who wanted them dead, breathing the same air, existing in the same building, separated only by iron and by the impossible bravery of a woman who refused to let evil win without a fight. This was only the beginning. The Leibowicz family would remain inside that tank, hidden in the heart of the brewery, for the next 8 months. And what happened during those months, the near discoveries, the close calls, and the unbelievable endurance required to survive in such conditions, would prove that sometimes the most extraordinary acts of resistance happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet darkness where hope refuses to die. Life inside tank number 7 was not life as any human being should know it. It was existence stripped down to its most brutal essentials: breathing, waiting, and the constant suppression of every natural human impulse. The interior of the tank was a cylinder of darkness so complete that the Leibowicz family lost the ability to distinguish between having their eyes open or closed. The air was thick with moisture and the sour tang of old beer that had seeped into the metal over decades of use. In winter, the cold was bone deep, turning their breath into visible clouds even in the blackness, making their joints ache and their teeth chatter, until Samuel feared the sound would carry through the walls. In summer, the heat turned the tank into an oven, the metal walls radiating warmth that left them dizzy and gasping, their clothes soaked with sweat, their water rations disappearing faster than Maria could safely replenish them. There was no space to stand fully upright except in the very center. There was no privacy, there was no comfort. There was only the knowledge that outside this iron prison there was certain death, and so they endured what should have been unendurable. The psychological toll was immediate and crushing. The children stopped speaking after the first week, not because they were told to, but because words seemed to lose meaning in the void. Esther, the youngest, would sit for hours running her fingers along the curved metal wall, tracing invisible patterns only she could see, her mind retreating to some interior place where light still existed. The middle child, a 10-year-old boy named Jakob, developed a fear of sleep because he couldn't tell when he was awake anymore, and the nightmares that came in the darkness felt exactly like the reality he woke up to. The oldest, 14-year-old Miriam, took on the role of timekeeper, scratching marks into the metal with a nail Maria had smuggled in, 1 mark for each day, a desperate attempt to hold on to the passage of time in a place where time had stopped. Rachel, the mother, prayed silently, her lips moving in the darkness, reciting every prayer she had ever learned over and over, until the words became a rhythm that kept her sane. And Samuel, the father, made himself into a statue during the daylight hours, convinced that if he moved even slightly, if he allowed himself one moment of carelessness, the metal would groan and betray them all. Maria's nightly visits became the only thing that tethered the family to the world of the living. Every evening after the last worker left and the brewery fell silent, Maria would climb the ladder to tank number 7, unlock the hatch, and peer inside with a covered lantern that gave off just enough light for her to see their faces without attracting attention from outside. She would lower down a bucket with food, usually bread and boiled potatoes, sometimes a piece of sausage or cheese when she could afford to steal it from her own rations without raising suspicion. She would pull up the waste bucket, a task so degrading and intimate that it bonded her to this family in ways that went beyond words. And she would whisper news from the outside world, carefully edited to give them hope, without revealing how truly hopeless the situation had become. She told them about Allied advances that were actually German victories. She told them about partisan resistance that had been crushed. She told them that liberation was coming soon. Even as the deportations from Tarnów continued every week, cattle cars packed with human beings headed east to places with names the world would later learn to speak with horror: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bełżec. But Maria couldn't tell them about the close calls that nearly ended everything. She couldn't tell them about the time a Nazi inspector decided to climb the ladder to tank number 7 during a surprise visit, wanting to check the cleanliness of the unused tanks, and how Maria had to physically block his path, claiming the tank had a broken seal and was contaminated with bacteria, risking a beating or worse to turn him away. She couldn't tell them about the night she arrived to find the hatch slightly ajar because the locking mechanism had loosened, and how she spent 2 hours in the freezing dark tightening it with tools, knowing that if anyone had walked by during the day and noticed, if anyone had been curious enough to climb up and look inside, the family would have been dragged out and shot in the brewery courtyard. She couldn't tell them about the factory worker who started asking too many questions about why tank number 7 was never put back into production, and how Maria had to fire him, inventing a story about theft, ruining his reputation to protect a secret he never even knew existed. The weight of it all was crushing Maria from the inside out. She stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. She lost weight until her clothes hung loose on her frame. Her hair began to grey. Her hands developed a tremor that never went away. Every knock on the door sent ice through her veins. Every unexpected visit from Nazi officials made her heart stop. She was living 2 lives simultaneously: the obedient brewery owner who smiled at German soldiers and fulfilled their orders with efficiency, and the rescuer who was committing an act of defiance so profound that discovery would mean torture before execution. She had no one to confide in except Piotr, the old worker who had helped with the initial smuggling, and even he didn't know the family was still there, still breathing, still waiting. Maria had made herself into an island of resistance, utterly alone, carrying the lives of 5 people on her shoulders every single day, wondering not if she would be caught, but when, and whether she would have the courage to stay silent under interrogation, or whether she would break and condemn them all. By the 4th month inside the tank, the Leibowicz family had developed a system of survival that was part ritual, part madness, and entirely necessary. They divided the darkness into shifts, with one person always staying awake to listen for sounds from below, for the pattern of footsteps that would indicate whether it was safe to whisper, or whether they needed to become corpses, utterly still and silent. They rationed their movements with the discipline of soldiers, allowing themselves to stretch only during the deepest part of the night, when the brewery was empty and the streets outside were quiet. They learned to communicate through touch in the blackness, a hand squeeze meaning danger, 2 taps meaning all clear, 3 meaning someone was struggling and needed support. Rachel taught her children to count their breaths, to make a game of seeing who could breathe the slowest and quietest, turning survival into something that felt almost like normalcy. Samuel carved tiny figurines from pieces of wood Maria smuggled in, working entirely by feel, creating small animals and shapes that his children could hold in the darkness, physical proof that beauty could still exist even in hell. But no system, no matter how carefully constructed, could prepare them for the day the Gestapo arrived, with orders to search every building in the industrial district for hidden resistance fighters. It was June of 1943, and the Polish underground had assassinated a high-ranking SS officer 2 towns over. The Nazi response was predictable and brutal: collective punishment, random executions, and house-to-house searches that turned entire neighborhoods inside out. Maria received only 10 minutes of warning from a sympathetic Polish policeman who owed her a favor, 10 minutes to make a decision that would determine whether 5 people lived or died. She couldn't evacuate the family from the tank because the building was already being surrounded. She couldn't hide the evidence of their presence because the waste bucket was full and the food containers were visible. All she could do was climb the ladder one last time, whisper through the hatch that the Gestapo was coming, and that no matter what they heard, no matter what happened below, they had to remain absolutely silent, even if they heard her screaming, even if they heard gunshots, even if every instinct told them to cry out or move or breathe too loudly. The Gestapo swept through the brewery like a plague. their black uniforms and death's head insignias, moving through every room with methodical efficiency. They overturned desks, ripped open storage cabinets, smashed barrels to check for hidden compartments, and interrogated every worker they found with questions delivered at the end of a pistol. Maria stood in the center of the production floor, forcing her face into an expression of cooperative confusion, answering their questions about her employees, her production schedules, her deliveries, while her mind screamed with the knowledge that 20 feet above her head, 5 people were holding their breath, listening to every word, wondering if this was the moment their hiding place would be discovered. The Gestapo officer in charge, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice like ice, walked slowly around the production floor, his eyes scanning the ceiling, the walls, the machinery, looking for anything out of place, anything that didn't belong, anything that suggested resistance or sabotage or mercy. Then he stopped directly beneath tank number 7. He tilted his head upward, staring at the massive fermentation tanks that loomed above like sleeping giants, and he asked Maria a question that made her blood turn to water. He wanted to know why one of the tanks appeared to be out of service, why it wasn't connected to any of the pipes or production lines, why it sat there empty and unused while the brewery was supposedly running at full capacity to meet German military orders. Maria's mind raced through a dozen possible lies, each one more dangerous than the last, before she landed on the only answer that might work. She told him the tank had developed a crack during the winter freeze, that the metal had split along a welded seam, and that using it now would contaminate the entire batch of beer with rust and bacteria. She pointed to imaginary stress marks on the exterior, invented a story about waiting for a repair specialist from Krakow who kept delaying because of the war, and prayed that this man, this agent of death standing before her, knew absolutely nothing about brewery equipment or metallurgy or the actual mechanics of beer production. The officer stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Then he turned to one of his subordinates and ordered him to climb the ladder and inspect the tank personally. Maria's heart stopped. Inside the tank, Samuel Leibowicz pressed his hand over his youngest daughter's mouth, feeling her tiny body trembling against his, knowing that in seconds a flashlight would pierce the darkness, would illuminate their faces, would end 8 months of survival in a single moment of discovery. The subordinate, a young soldier who looked barely old enough to shave, began climbing the ladder, each rung bringing him closer to the hatch, closer to the truth, closer to a revelation that would result in immediate execution for everyone involved. Maria watched him climb, her fingernails digging into her palms, blood seeping between her fingers, and she did the only thing she could think of. She screamed. She screamed that the tank was dangerous, that the crack had made the structure unstable, that if he opened the hatch, the entire thing could collapse and kill him, that she couldn't be responsible for a German soldier dying because of faulty equipment. It was absurd, it was transparent, it should never have worked. But the officer, perhaps tired from a long day of searching, perhaps annoyed by this entire assignment, perhaps simply wanting to move on to the next building, ordered his subordinate back down and told Maria she had 2 weeks to get the tank repaired, or it would be confiscated for scrap metal. Then he left, taking his death squad with him, leaving behind only the smell of boot leather and cigarette smoke. When Maria finally climbed the ladder that night and opened the hatch, she found the Leibowicz family exactly as she had left them hours before, frozen in position, barely breathing, their bodies locked in a state of terror so profound that even safety couldn't immediately release them. Samuel still had his hand over Esther's mouth, though the little girl had long since stopped trying to make sound. Rachel's eyes were open but unseeing, staring into the darkness like someone who had already accepted death and was waiting for it to arrive. The older children were curled into themselves, fetal positions of absolute surrender. Maria whispered that the danger had passed, that the Gestapo was gone, that they had survived, but her words seemed to bounce off them like stones thrown at a wall. It took nearly an hour before Samuel's hand finally released his daughter's face, before Rachel's breathing returned to something approaching normal, before any of them could move or speak or acknowledge that they were still alive. That night marked a turning point. The family realized with crushing clarity that survival wasn't just about hiding. It was about maintaining sanity in conditions designed to destroy the human spirit, and they were losing that battle one silent day at a time. The Gestapo's ultimatum about repairing the tank created a new crisis that Maria had to solve immediately. She couldn't actually repair a crack that didn't exist, but she also couldn't let the Nazis return and confiscate the tank for scrap metal, which would require emptying it first and would inevitably lead to discovery. So Maria did what she had been doing for months. She lied with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. She forged documents from a fictional repair specialist in Krakow, complete with official-looking stamps she carved from potatoes and pressed into ink, claiming that the necessary parts were on back order due to wartime shortages and that the repair was scheduled for September. She submitted these documents to the local Nazi administrative office, where a bored clerk filed them away without a second glance, and the matter was forgotten. But the close call had revealed something terrifying. The longer the family stayed in the tank, the more opportunities there were for random chance, human curiosity, or bureaucratic efficiency to destroy them. Every day they remained was another roll of the dice, another test of luck that eventually, statistically, mathematically, they would fail. Meanwhile, the world outside the brewery was collapsing into greater horror. By summer of 1943, the Tarnów ghetto had been almost completely liquidated. Thousands of families had been deported to Auschwitz, their homes emptied, their possessions stolen, their existence erased from the official records as if they had never lived at all. The few Jews who remained were kept alive only as slave labor in factories, producing goods for the German war machine, worked to death in conditions that made the inside of tank number 7 seem almost merciful by comparison. Maria heard stories from workers who had witnessed the deportations, tales of families separated on railway platforms, of children torn from their mothers' arms, of elderly people shot in the street because they couldn't walk fast enough to the trains. She heard these stories, and she climbed the ladder every night knowing that the 5 people inside her tank were among the last surviving Jews in the entire region, that their existence was a statistical impossibility, a miracle born of rust-stained metal, and one woman's refusal to accept that genocide was inevitable. But the miracle was fracturing under its own weight. Inside the tank, Rachel Leibowicz was deteriorating rapidly. The lack of sunlight, the poor nutrition, the constant stress, and the suffocating darkness had broken something fundamental inside her. She stopped eating, pushing her rations toward her children, even when Maria begged her to take care of herself. She stopped sleeping, her eyes open in the blackness for days at a time, her mind trapped in loops of memory and grief. She would whisper the names of relatives who had been taken, reciting them like a rosary, a litany of the dead that grew longer every week. Samuel tried to hold her together, tried to remind her that they had to survive for the children, that giving up now would make everything they had endured meaningless, but his words couldn't reach her anymore. She had crossed into a place beyond hope, beyond fear, beyond even despair. She had become a ghost inhabiting a living body, waiting for permission to stop existing. Maria recognized the signs because she saw them in her own mirror every morning. The weight of carrying this secret, of living every moment, knowing that one mistake would kill 6 people, was destroying her as surely as the darkness was destroying Rachel. She had stopped attending church because she couldn't reconcile the God she had been taught to worship with the God who allowed this suffering to exist. She had stopped socializing with neighbors because she couldn't make small talk about weather and gossip when she knew what was happening 20 feet above her head every night. She had become a machine programmed for a single purpose: keep them alive, keep them hidden, keep them breathing until the war ended or until she was caught, whichever came first. And as summer turned to autumn and the leaves began to fall outside the brewery windows, as German radio broadcasts continued to promise victory while the tide of war slowly, invisibly, began to turn against them, Maria understood that the hardest part wasn't getting the family into the tank. The hardest part was keeping them human while they were inside it, and she was failing at that task more with every passing day. October of 1943 brought the first real test of whether the Leibowicz family could endure what was becoming an indefinite imprisonment. Rachel's mental collapse accelerated to the point where she would rock back and forth in the darkness, humming lullabies at volumes that threatened to expose them all, her mind retreating so far into the past that she no longer seemed to understand where she was or why silence was necessary. Samuel would hold her, his hand gently covering her mouth when the humming grew too loud, his own heart breaking as he felt his wife disintegrating in his arms, knowing that the woman he had married no longer existed in any meaningful way. The children watched their mother's transformation with the hollow eyes of young people who had already seen too much death to be shocked by it, and they understood, without being told, that survival sometimes meant watching the people you love destroy themselves slowly in the dark, with no way to help them and no way to stop it from happening. Maria began bringing small doses of sleeping powder dissolved in water, something to give Rachel a few hours of peace, a mercy that was also a risk because deep sleep meant less control, meant the possibility of talking in dreams, of crying out in nightmares that could echo through the metal walls. The physical conditions inside the tank had also reached a critical point. 8 months of human habitation in an unventilated space had created an atmosphere that was barely breathable, thick with the accumulated smell of unwashed bodies, waste, fear sweat, and desperation. The blankets Maria had provided were now rotted through with mildew despite her best efforts to replace them. The wooden floor she had installed was warping from moisture, creating gaps where the metal beneath showed through, cold and unforgiving. The children had developed rashes across their skin from the constant dampness, angry red patches that itched and bled, but couldn't be treated with anything more than rags soaked in cold water. Jacob, the middle child, had developed a cough that wouldn't go away, a deep rattling sound that terrified Samuel because he knew that in their weakened state, even a simple infection could become fatal, and there was no doctor, no medicine, no help available except what Maria could steal from a town pharmacy without raising questions about why a brewery owner needed antibiotics. The psychological isolation was manifesting in stranger ways as the months accumulated into an impossible stretch of time. Miriam, the oldest daughter, had stopped making marks on the wall to count the days because she said it didn't matter anymore, that time had stopped having meaning, that they were already dead and just didn't know it yet. She spoke these words with the flat affect of someone much older, someone who had lost the ability to feel anything except a dull acceptance of horror. Esther, the youngest, had developed an imaginary friend she called the Copper Lady, a figure she claimed lived in the walls of the tank and told her stories about a world outside where the sun still existed and children could play without fear. Samuel encouraged this fantasy because it was the only thing that kept his youngest daughter engaged with reality at all, even if the reality she was engaging with was entirely invented. He would listen to Esther whisper conversations with the Copper Lady in the darkness, describing elaborate games and adventures, and he would thank God or fate or whatever force was keeping them alive that at least one of his children still had enough humanity left to imagine something better than this. Maria's own breaking point came in late October when she arrived one night to find that Jacob's cough had worsened to the point where he was spitting up blood into a rag, his small body racked with spasms that he tried desperately to muffle but couldn't completely control. She stared at this 10-year-old boy dying slowly in the darkness, and she made a decision that violated every rule she had set for herself. She was going to take him out. She was going to smuggle him to a doctor she trusted, a man who had treated resistance fighters before and who might be willing to help, even knowing the risk. Samuel refused. He told Maria that removing Jacob would endanger everyone, that if the boy was seen, if anyone recognized him as Jewish, if the doctor turned them in or if they were stopped on the street, the entire network of survival would collapse. But Maria was beyond caring about logic. She had watched these people suffer for 8 months, and she was not going to watch a child die from a treatable illness because she was too afraid to act. The argument that followed was the first time any of them had raised their voices above a whisper since entering the tank. An explosion of 8 months of suppressed emotion that left them all shaking and terrified, and somehow more human than they had been in weeks. In the end, they reached a compromise born of desperation. Maria would bring the doctor to the brewery under the pretense of treating her for a fictional illness, and once inside, she would lead him to the tank and trust that his oath to heal would overcome his fear of Nazi reprisal. It was insane. It was dangerous. It expanded the circle of knowledge to include another person who could betray them, either intentionally or through carelessness or under torture. But Jacob was dying, and death was a certainty while betrayal was only a possibility, so they chose the risk over the guarantee and prayed that they were making the right choice. 3 nights later, Dr. Henryk Wojciechowski, a 62-year-old physician who had delivered half the babies in Tarnów before the war, climbed the ladder to tank number 7 with his medical bag, looked inside at the 5 skeletal figures huddled in the darkness, and wept. Then he went to work, diagnosing Jacob with bacterial pneumonia, providing antibiotics he claimed were for his own personal use, and swearing on his dead wife's grave that he would never speak of what he had seen. He became the second person outside the family who knew the truth, the second thread in a web of conspiracy that was growing more fragile and more miraculous with every day that passed. January of 1944 arrived with news that changed everything. The Soviet Red Army was advancing westward, pushing the German forces back across Eastern Europe in a series of brutal winter campaigns that left entire divisions destroyed in the snow. Maria heard the reports on contraband radio broadcasts that workers whispered about in the brewery. Stories of German retreats, of territory recaptured, of the unstoppable momentum of the Soviet war machine grinding toward Poland. For the first time in nearly a year, she allowed herself to believe that liberation might actually come, that the Leibowicz family might survive to see the outside world again, that her impossible gamble might actually succeed. But hope, she discovered, was more dangerous than despair because it made people careless, made them believe the worst was over, when in reality the most dangerous phase was just beginning. The Nazis, sensing their empire collapsing around them, became more vicious, more paranoid, more willing to murder anyone who might pose a threat or who simply existed as a reminder of their failures. The executions in Tarnów increased, the searches intensified, and the brewery, which had operated under relative protection for so long, suddenly found itself under much closer scrutiny. The new scrutiny came in the form of SS Hauptsturmführer Otto Kessler, a career officer transferred from the Eastern Front who had been tasked with ensuring that all remaining industrial facilities in the region were operating at maximum efficiency for the war effort. Kessler was not like the bored bureaucrats and lazy soldiers who had inspected the brewery before. He was methodical, intelligent, and deeply suspicious of everyone and everything around him. He arrived at the brewery in mid-January with a team of assistants and announced that he would be conducting a complete inventory and assessment of the facility, a process that would take several weeks and would involve examining every piece of equipment, every storage room, every tank, every corner of the building. Maria's blood went cold. She tried to delay, claiming that a full inspection would interrupt production and prevent her from fulfilling the beer orders for German officers, but Kessler dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. The war was nearly lost, he told her, and what mattered now was not beer but accountability, ensuring that no one was hiding anything, stealing anything, or sabotaging the Reich's final efforts to achieve victory. Kessler's team began their assessment on the ground floor and worked their way up, systematically cataloguing every barrel, every bottle, every tool and machine. Maria watched them move through her brewery like ants consuming everything in their path, and she knew with absolute certainty that when they reached the second floor and began examining the fermentation tanks, they would discover tank number 7. They would demand to know why it remained unused, and no amount of lies about cracks or repairs or contamination would satisfy a man like Kessler. She had perhaps 1 week before they reached that point, 1 week to make a decision that would determine the fate of 5 people who had survived the impossible for nearly 12 months. She could try to evacuate the family, smuggle them out of the brewery and find a new hiding place, but where would they go when the entire region was saturated with Nazi patrols and informants? She could try to bribe Kessler, offer him money or goods to overlook the tank, but a true believer like him would more likely arrest her for attempted corruption than accept anything she offered. Or she could do nothing, maintain the lie until the very end, and hope that some miracle, some intervention of fate or luck or divine providence would save them one last time. The decision was made for her 3 days later when Esther, the youngest Leibowicz child, became violently ill with what Dr. Wojciechowski diagnosed as appendicitis during an emergency midnight visit. The child's appendix was on the verge of rupturing, and without immediate surgery, she would die within hours from septic shock. The doctor told Maria, in a voice shaking with grief, that he could not perform the surgery inside a beer tank with no light, no proper instruments, no sterilization, and no way to manage the post-operative care. The child had to be taken to a hospital, or she had to be allowed to die, and those were the only two options available. Samuel Leibowicz, holding his feverish daughter in his arms, made the decision that no parent should ever have to make. He told Maria to take Esther out, to save his daughter's life, even if it meant exposing the rest of them, even if it meant the end of everything they had endured. Rachel, emerging briefly from her mental fog, grabbed Maria's hand and begged her not to let their baby die in the darkness, to give her at least a chance to see the sky one more time before the end came. Maria wrapped the 6-year-old child in blankets, carried her down the ladder like she weighed nothing at all, and made a decision that would either prove her heroism or confirm her madness. She brought Esther to Dr. Wojciechowski's private clinic in the dead of night, laid her on the operating table, and told him to save her life regardless of the consequences. The doctor worked for 3 hours by lamplight, removing the inflamed appendix with hands that had lost none of their skill despite his age, while Maria stood guard at the window watching for patrols. When it was done, when the child was stitched closed and sleeping under the effects of anesthesia, Maria faced another impossible choice. She couldn't bring Esther back to the tank during her recovery because the child needed clean bandages, proper rest, and monitoring for infection, none of which were possible in their metal prison. So she did the unthinkable. She brought Esther to her own home, to her own bedroom, and told anyone who asked that the child was her niece from Krakow, orphaned by a bombing raid, come to live with her until the war ended. It was a lie so transparent, so easily disproven, that it should have fallen apart immediately. But somehow, miraculously, impossibly, it held. And for 2 weeks, while Kessler's team moved closer and closer to the second floor of the brewery, while Samuel and Rachel and Miriam and Jakob remained locked in the darkness waiting for discovery, Esther Leibowicz recovered in a real bed, under real blankets with real sunlight streaming through a window, experiencing freedom she couldn't even remember and would have to surrender the moment she was strong enough to walk. On February 2nd, 1944, SS Hauptsturmführer Kessler and his team reached the second floor of the brewery and stood before the row of fermentation tanks like judges preparing to deliver a verdict. Maria stood beside them, her face a mask of calm professionalism that hid the screaming terror inside her chest, knowing that in one of those massive metal cylinders, 4 human beings were holding their breath, listening to every footstep, every word, every sound that might indicate whether they would live through the next hour. Kessler walked slowly along the line of tanks, examining each one with the careful attention of a man who had been trained to find discrepancies, to notice things that didn't belong, to root out deception wherever it hid. He stopped at tank number 7, the one that had remained unused for over a year, the one that Maria had protected with lies and forgeries and screams, and he asked the same question that had nearly destroyed everything months before. Why was this tank not in production when the brewery was supposedly operating at full capacity? Maria began her rehearsed explanation about the crack, the repair delays, the contamination risk, but before she could finish, Kessler cut her off with a raised hand and ordered one of his assistants to climb the ladder and open the hatch for inspection. This was the moment. This was the end. Maria's mind raced through 100 scenarios, each one ending in gunfire and bodies, and the knowledge that she had failed, that 12 months of survival would be erased in 12 seconds of discovery. She considered throwing herself at Kessler, creating a distraction, starting a fire, doing anything to prevent that hatch from being opened, but she was one woman against armed soldiers, and any resistance would only confirm their suspicions. So she stood frozen, watching the assistant climb the ladder rung by rung, getting closer to the truth with every step. Inside the tank, Samuel had positioned himself directly beneath the hatch, prepared to grab whoever looked inside and pull them in, to fight with his bare hands for a few more seconds of life before the bullets came. Rachel held Miriam and Jacob in the farthest corner, her hand clamped over Jacob's mouth to silence the cough that would kill them all. They could hear the footsteps on the ladder, the scrape of boots on metal, the sound of breathing just on the other side of the iron that separated life from death. The assistant reached the top of the ladder and placed his hand on the locking mechanism, preparing to turn it, to open the hatch, to reveal what had been hidden for so long. Then the air raid sirens began to wail. Soviet bombers, targeting the railway junction 3 kilometers from the brewery, filled the sky with the thunder of engines and the whistle of falling explosives. The ground shook as bombs detonated in the distance, close enough to rattle the windows, close enough to send dust falling from the ceiling, close enough to make even hardened SS officers instinctively duck and look for cover. Kessler shouted orders over the noise, commanding his team to evacuate to the ground floor shelter immediately, abandoning the inspection in favor of survival. The assistant on the ladder scrambled down, following his commander, leaving the hatch unopened, leaving the secret undiscovered by mere seconds. Maria followed them down, her legs barely able to support her weight, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would burst through her ribs. The bombing lasted 20 minutes. 20 minutes of explosions and sirens and chaos, and when it finally ended and the all-clear sounded, Kessler emerged from the shelter covered in dust and visibly shaken. He told Maria that he was suspending the inspection temporarily to focus on more critical security matters, that he would return to complete the assessment when things stabilized, and then he left, taking his team with him, leaving behind only a promise that felt like a death sentence delayed rather than cancelled. Maria waited until the brewery was completely empty, until every worker had gone home and every sound had faded into silence, before she climbed the ladder to tank number 7 and opened the hatch. She found the Leibowicz family exactly as they had been, still frozen in their defensive positions, still holding their breath, unable to process that they had survived yet another impossible moment. She told them about the bombing, about the evacuation, about how close they had come to the end, and Samuel began to laugh, a sound so unexpected and so wrong in that metal tomb that it frightened everyone who heard it. He laughed because there was nothing else left to do, because the absurdity of being saved by Soviet bombs while hiding from German soldiers was too perfect to be anything but cosmic comedy, because after 12 months of silence and fear, laughter was the only human response left available to him. But the laughter turned to tears, and the tears turned to sobs, and soon all 4 of them were crying in the darkness, releasing months of accumulated terror and grief and exhaustion in a flood that couldn't be stopped or controlled. The next day, Maria made a decision that she knew was reckless but could no longer avoid. She brought Esther back to the tank. The child had recovered enough to move, and keeping her separated from her family any longer was both dangerous and cruel, increasing the risk of exposure while denying them the comfort of being together. Esther climbed the ladder with Maria's help, still weak from surgery, still confused about why she had to go back into the darkness after experiencing light, and when she reached the top and her mother's arms closed around her, the sound of Rachel's weeping echoed through the tank, like a prayer answered by a God who had been silent for far too long. The family was whole again, reunited in their prison, and for the first time in months they allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would actually survive this war. They had endured for 1 full year inside tank number 7, 12 months of impossible suffering that should have killed them 100 times over, but somehow hadn't. And as winter began to loosen its grip, and the distant sound of artillery fire grew closer with each passing week, they understood that the end was coming, one way or another, and all they could do was hold on for just a little bit longer. March of 1944 brought chaos that made the previous year look almost peaceful by comparison. The Soviet advance accelerated dramatically, pushing German forces into full retreat across eastern Poland, and the Nazi administration in Tarnów began executing a scorched earth policy, destroying anything of value that might fall into Soviet hands. The brewery received orders to dismantle all equipment and prepare for evacuation westward. Orders that Maria knew she could not follow without exposing the family she had protected for 13 months. She stalled, claiming mechanical problems, missing parts, transportation delays, inventing obstacles that didn't exist to buy time that was running out faster than she could count. Meanwhile, the streets of Tarnów descended into pandemonium as German soldiers retreated, Polish collaborators fled, and civilians emerged from hiding to reclaim what remained of their city. Gunfire echoed at all hours, buildings burned, Bodies appeared in gutters, victims of last-minute executions or random violence or simply the collapse of all order and authority. And inside tank number 7, the Leibowicz family listened to the sounds of liberation approaching and wondered if they would survive long enough to see it, or if they would be killed in the final hours by retreating soldiers looking for someone to blame for Germany's defeat. The end came on a freezing morning in late March, when Soviet artillery began shelling the industrial district, targeting any structure that might house remaining German forces. A shell struck the brewery's west wall, blowing out windows and sending shrapnel tearing through the production floor, miraculously missing the fermentation tanks, but destroying much of the ground-level equipment. Maria had been sleeping in her office, refusing to leave the building because she knew that if she wasn't there to protect it, looters or soldiers or desperate refugees would pour in and the tank would be discovered. The explosion threw her from her cot, slamming her against the wall hard enough to crack 2 ribs and leave her gasping for air. She dragged herself to her feet, tasted blood in her mouth, and realized with perfect clarity that the building was no longer safe, that the next shell might hit the tank directly, and that she had to evacuate the family immediately or risk them dying from Soviet liberation after surviving Nazi occupation. She climbed the ladder one final time, each rung sending daggers of pain through her broken ribs, and when she opened the hatch, she spoke words that the Leibowicz family had waited 13 months to hear. "It's time to leave. The war is ending. You're going to survive this." Getting them out was harder than getting them in had been. 13 months without sunlight had left them nearly blind, their eyes unable to handle even the dim light of the damaged brewery. 13 months without walking had atrophied their muscles to the point where the ladder descent was treacherous, each person having to be guided down rung by rung while their legs shook and threatened to give out. 13 months of minimal food had left them skeletal, their clothes hanging off their frames like fabric on wire hangers, their faces gaunt and unrecognizable. Esther, now 7 years old, cried when she saw the sky through the blown-out wall, not from joy but from pain, the brightness too much for eyes that had known only darkness. Jakob collapsed at the bottom of the ladder, his pneumonia-weakened lungs unable to handle the exertion. Miriam stood in the center of the production floor, slowly turning in circles, staring at a space larger than the tank, unable to process that walls could be this far apart, that ceilings could be this high, that the world still existed beyond the iron cylinder that had become her entire universe. Samuel and Rachel held each other, swaying on unsteady legs, looking at Maria with expressions that contained more gratitude and grief than words could ever express. Maria hid them in the brewery's cellar while she ventured into the streets to assess the situation. What she found was a city in transition, German forces streaming westward in retreat, while Soviet advance units began appearing from the east, and in the space between the two armies, a temporary absence of authority that made anything possible. She returned to the cellar and told the Leibowicz family that they needed to stay hidden for just a few more days, that the Soviets were coming but hadn't fully secured the area, that being discovered now by the wrong people could still be fatal. So they waited, not in a tank this time, but in a basement with a door they could open, with light they could see, with the knowledge that their imprisonment was truly ending. Maria brought them real food, soup and bread and meat that their shrunken stomachs could barely handle, and she watched them eat with the slow, careful movements of people learning how to be human again. She brought them water to wash with, and when Rachel saw her reflection in a bucket for the first time in over a year, she didn't recognize the elderly woman staring back at her, couldn't reconcile that face with the 38-year-old mother she remembered being. On March 23, 1944, Soviet troops entered Tarnów officially, and the Nazi occupation of the city ended after nearly 5 years of terror. Maria led the Leibowicz family out of the brewery into a world transformed, a city of ruins and survivors where the rules had changed overnight, but the trauma remained. They registered with Soviet authorities as displaced persons, providing false documentation that Maria had prepared, claiming they had hidden in the countryside with sympathetic farmers, a lie designed to protect Maria from Soviet suspicion, because helping Jews under Nazi occupation was sometimes viewed as collaboration depending on who was asking the questions. The family was processed, given temporary housing in a building that had once been a German officers' quarters, and told to wait for further instructions about resettlement or repatriation. They had survived. Against every statistical probability, against all logic and reason, against the full machinery of industrial genocide designed specifically to ensure their extermination, they had survived. But survival, they quickly discovered, was not the same as living, and the real struggle, the struggle to reclaim their humanity after 13 months in darkness, was only just beginning. The Leibowicz family never spoke publicly about their time in tank number 7. Not during the Soviet occupation, not during the communist era that followed, not even after immigrating to Israel in 1951, where other Holocaust survivors shared their stories freely. They remained silent for 32 years, a silence born from shame they shouldn't have felt, from survivors' guilt that haunted them daily, and from a fundamental inability to explain what 13 months of darkness had done to their souls. Rachel never fully recovered mentally, spending the rest of her life drifting between moments of clarity and periods where she would hum those same lullabies from the tank, her mind retreating to the one place where she still had some control. Jakob's lungs never fully healed, and he died of respiratory failure in 1963 at age 30, his body finally surrendering to damage that began in that metal prison. Esther carried a scar across her abdomen from the emergency appendectomy, and another invisible scar across her psyche from being the child who got to see sunlight while her family remained in darkness. Miriam became a teacher, dedicating her life to ensuring that children learned the truth about the Holocaust. But she never told her own students about the tank, never revealed that she had lived through what she taught. Only Samuel ever attempted to document what happened, writing a brief account in 1976 that he sealed in an envelope with instructions that it not be opened until after his death. Maria Górska continued operating the brewery until it was nationalized by the communist government in 1947, at which point she was given a small pension and a medal for her contributions to the war effort, honors that made no mention of the family she had saved, because revealing that truth would have raised uncomfortable questions about why she had collaborated with Nazi beer production in the first place. She lived alone in a small apartment in Tarnów, never remarrying, never speaking about the war except in the vaguest terms, carrying the weight of what she had done in absolute silence. The Leibowicz family sent her letters occasionally, carefully worded messages that never explicitly mentioned the tank, but expressed gratitude for unnamed acts of kindness, and Maria kept every letter in a box under her bed, reading them when the nightmares became too much to bear. She died in 1978 of heart failure, and at her funeral, 5 people appeared who no one in Tarnów recognized, a family who had traveled from Israel to stand at the grave of a woman most of the town had forgotten, whispering prayers in Hebrew over the coffin before disappearing as quietly as they had arrived. The truth remained hidden until 1984, when Samuel Leibowicz died in Tel Aviv, and his children, following his instructions, opened the sealed envelope and read his account of the 13 months in tank number 7. They contacted Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust memorial, and after extensive verification that included testimony from Dr. Wojciechowski's surviving family and brewery records that showed tank number 7's unusual period of non-use, Maria Górska was posthumously recognized as righteous among the nations, the highest honor Israel bestows on non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Her name was added to the wall at Yad Vashem, alongside thousands of other rescuers, a single line of text that couldn't possibly capture the magnitude of what she had done. Maria Górska, Poland, saved the Leibowicz family, 5 people, 1943 to 1944. The brewery in Tarnów was torn down in the 1990s to make room for a shopping center, and tank number 7 was cut apart for scrap metal, its iron recycled into structural beams and rebar, its history erased except for a small plaque that the city installed, noting that an act of rescue had occurred on the premises during the war, offering no details, no names, no story. But the story matters because it reveals a truth that gets lost in the overwhelming statistics of the Holocaust, that amid industrial-scale murder, individual acts of impossible courage still occurred, that ordinary people with no training and no support found ways to resist genocide using nothing but creativity and a refusal to accept evil as inevitable. Maria Górska was not a soldier, not a spy, not a member of any organized resistance. She was a brewery owner who looked at a family marked for death and decided that a beer tank could become a sanctuary, and then spent 13 months proving that decision right through sheer force of will. She lied to Nazis, forged documents, screamed at armed soldiers, and risked execution every single day for over a year because she believed that 5 human lives mattered more than her own safety. That's not just heroism. That's a statement about what it means to be human, about the obligation we have to protect each other even when the cost is unthinkable, even when success seems impossible, even when no one will ever know or care what we did. The Leibowicz family's survival was statistically miraculous. Of the 15,000 Jews who lived in Tarnów before the war, fewer than 700 survived, and most of those survived in concentration camps, not in hiding. The odds of 5 people remaining undetected for 13 months in an occupied city, in a building that was regularly inspected in a space that should have been discovered 100 times over, defies every reasonable calculation. But it happened because one woman decided it would happen, because she climbed a ladder every night for over a year, because she chose compassion over compliance and humanity over self-preservation. And the fact that this story remained hidden for 4 decades, that Maria died without recognition, that the tank was destroyed and forgotten, tells you everything you need to know about how history gets written. The loudest voices survive, the simplest narratives win, and the quiet miracles performed in darkness by ordinary people who asked for nothing in return get buried under the weight of larger tragedies and more convenient truths. This is why we tell these stories, not because they have happy endings, because this story doesn't really have a happy ending, not with Rachel's shattered mind and Jacob's early death and Maria's lonely final years. We tell these stories because they prove that even in humanity's darkest moments, even when the machinery of genocide was operating at peak efficiency, even when every logical reason to give up was screaming in your face, resistance was still possible. A beer tank became an ark. A businesswoman became a savior. And 5 people who should have died, who were supposed to die according to the Nazi plan, lived instead, had children, had grandchildren, passed down a story of survival that began in absolute darkness and ended in light. That's not just history. That's evidence that what we choose to do in moments of crisis actually matters, that individual moral choices can defy systemic evil, and that sometimes the most extraordinary acts of heroism happen in places so ordinary, so unexpected, so impossible that we almost miss them entirely. The woman who hid a family in a beer tank didn't just save 5 lives. She saved the possibility of hope itself, proving that even when the world descends into madness, sanity still exists for those brave enough to protect it, one ladder climb at a time, one night after another, until finally, impossibly, miraculously, the darkness ends.